Okay, so I want to begin here showing you the materials that I use for this applique technique. Obviously, we start with our fabric. For this demonstration, I'm going to be working on a small border, and I'm going to be using this as my background fabric, and this is the fabric for my applique. Then we obviously need our design. This is the design I will be working with. Since I print out my own patterns, I usually reverse them for this technique. But if you have a commercial pattern or any pattern that you're using where you're working with the right side of the pattern, then for this technique you would have to reverse it. So you would have to either use a light box or hold it up against the window or something to trace your pattern. Okay, and that will be traced onto fusible interfacing. This is the interfacing that I purchased by the meter here. This is what it's available to me locally. I don't know what you would be able to find, but what you want is a very thin interfacing. Okay, and this side you can feel, this is the glue side of it. It's pretty transparent, as you can see. Okay, so as thin as possible. Okay. Then, to continue to trace our pattern, you will need some type of pen or marker. This, once again, it depends on what's available to you. I mean, these are the different markers that I have found locally. What's important here is that it not run, that it be permanent. Okay, and for example, this one that I really like that I buy locally. Okay, and it's a permanent marker. Okay. I really like Sharpies for some things, for example, labels and stuff. But here I would be a little bit careful. I think you would test it first, because what I found is that sometimes this will run if you are applying some glue or a fray check to the piece, and so I would be a little bit careful. Always test your pen before you use it on your actual piece. Okay. Then, as far as needles go, I like to use a size 10 sharp. This is also a thing of personal matter. I like a very fine, thin needle so that it will go through the fabric really easily. But it's a matter of choice, really. Then, one of the things that I use that sometimes combined is some glue, some basting glue. This is the glue that I like, this is Quilter's Choice. Okay, and I will use glue or little applique pins, or sometimes I will use them together. These applique pins, as you can see, are very, very short. They go in very smoothly through the fabric without distorting. So, okay. Then something optional that for me depends on the type of fabric that I'm using is some fray check. This really depends on the particular fabric that I'm appliquing, because I find that some fray more than others. In some cases I don't really need it, but if there's any doubt, then I always like to apply a little bit to the edges of my piece. Okay. Then I also like to use thread conditioner. Okay. And we need some sharp needles. These are the ones that, scissors. These are the two that I like, especially for this technique. I like these sharp face scars. They have a really sharp point, so you can cut tiny, tiny pieces with them. Okay. Then obviously the big question here, what makes or breaks this technique is the type of thread used. And my personal preference is silk thread for very tiny pieces. Okay, I find that I like this YLI silk that comes in neutral colors, and most of them, I mean, most pieces will work with this for most applique pieces. But sometimes I have found, especially with dark fabrics like, say, a dark blue or red, sometimes you can really see the stitches with this, so then I like to use some other silk threads, but my preference is silk. You know, there's silk that comes in other colors too. You know, like this red, or especially the darker fabrics. Yeah. And then, depending always on the size of the piece, because here we're talking about very, very tiny pieces. So for within the tiny range, the bigger pieces, I will like to use 1 ply of embroidery thread too. This will always depend on the size of the piece that I'm working with. For the tiniest pieces, I like to use the silk thread. Okay. And then finally, we need a pressing surface, iron. And I really recommend using applique or a Teflon sheet for this technique, because since we are working with fusible, there's glue that could stick to your iron, and you want to try to avoid that as much as possible to keep your iron clean. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do here is trace my pattern onto my fusible interfacing. And I'm going to work at my light box. I've got this nice large light box that I can work on. Since this particular pattern I did print on the right side, then to be able to trace it, I'm going to turn the pattern around. Okay, and trace from the back side. Working with the light box really makes this easier, because then the pattern comes through a lot easier. I mean, you can see it very clearly here. Okay, so I'm going to place my interfacing on this and start tracing. If you want, you can also use some tape or something to just hold it in place so it doesn't move while you're tracing. Okay, and then I simply, where I'm going to follow the lines and trace my pattern. In this, when you have a piece like this that has additional pieces, like in this one, this is a scroll pattern, and then it's got these little leaves. And the big challenge in this particular one will be precisely these tiny leaves. So what I will do is first trace the scroll itself, and then individual leaves off to one side. You know, like, say right in here. I will probably use the pattern itself to trace the leaves, or just draw them freely. So I will trace the whole pattern. Okay. And then once I'm finished, I will count the number of leaves and trace those on there too. After tracing the design, I've cut around the interfacing, sort of close to the lines, to avoid using too much of that extra interfacing. And I'm going to press this then onto my fabric, the fabric that I want to use to applique onto the background. And what you're going to do is you want to put this onto the back side of the fabric. This is the front and this is the back. Oh. Okay. And this is where I really recommend using your Teflon sheet to avoid getting any of this stuck onto your iron. So just hold the iron down in place for a few seconds. Okay, as you can see, it sort of sticks to this, so there might be a little bit of glue that otherwise would stick to your iron. Okay, and there we go. And now we're going to cut this piece out and start to applique it to our background strip. I'm back at my light box now, because one of the things I wanted to share was how I work to make sure that I've placed my design on my background fabric. I'm not very, very strict. In many designs, I actually eyeball things. But sometimes when you're working, for example, with a border where there's a repetitive design, you want to pretty much stay on line. So what I do then is, the first thing I do is I always cut either my strip or my background block, whatever, about an inch bigger than what I really need, just in case I need to trim it later. So in this case, this is a 2.5 inch strip. My finished strip is actually going to measure 1.5 inches. So with the seam allowances, I really need to trim this to 2 inches. And I've allowed also for some space on the sides. What I've done to be able to place my design correctly is I have folded this in half and pressed it to get a line there and also here. And that gives me a center both vertically and horizontally. Okay. In this case, since I'm working with the same sheet, this is the right side of my design, so I'm going to place this strip up on the right side. Okay. This is the center, but see, even here I'm sort of eyeballing it, and I am using about the center of my design here. Okay. Okay. And then I am going to use, this is the pencil that I like to use to trace. This is a Sketch and Wash, a general Sketch and Wash pencil. I really like this for marking because it comes off really easily afterwards. And here I will not trace the whole design. What I like to do is just put some guides just to help me place my design. Okay, but I don't need to trace the whole thing. There are just certain parts where I know that I need to place the applique piece carefully, and that is where I will mark just a few guidelines. Okay. And in a design like this one, with these little leaves, I do not worry about marking those leaves. Those I pretty much will eyeball them. I said nobody knows, except me, that it has not a precise representation of the original design. And sometimes I don't think it's necessary. I mean, if it's off a little bit, that's just not a big deal. Okay? So, here you can see the mark lines here, and this is going to help me then to just guide me, that's what they're called, guidelines, to place my applique piece and start appliquing that tiny scroll pattern. I've cut out my scroll, my little scroll, and now I'm ready to applique. So the first thing is I need to fasten it in some way to my background piece, to my background border here. Okay, to try to keep it in place as I applique it. So sometimes once again, this depends on the size, the shape of the piece that I'm working with. And I will either use some basting glue or applique pens or a combination of both. So in a case like this, usually what I do is I will just use a little dab on a couple of spots. To hold it in place. And here I will work with my placement guides. Just a couple of places here. It's important not to put too much of this on, because if you get it like all the way to the edge, then you'll have a really hard time getting your needle through. And the other thing that I forgot to mention was that I like this basting glue. It's a Quilter's Choice basting glue. But I've also used just regular white glue, diluted white glue on some occasions, so that works just as well if you are not able to find this basting glue. or any other basting glue that you like to use. Okay, so just a couple places here towards the end. Okay. Now this is still, since this is a long skinny piece, this might still move. So in this case what I do is I will use some applique pens to help me too. And what I do is I do not pin onto the piece but to the background. So I will take one little, almost like a stitch here on one side, go over my applique piece, and then pin onto the other side of that. Okay. And once again here, the purpose is only to help keep it in place as I applique, and also as I work along I will start taking those pins out because we don't want any distortion. Maybe one more here. Okay, and now we're pretty much ready to go. So on my tiny pieces, applique pieces, I like to use this technique where I use a fusible web to cut out, to put on the back of my piece and cut it out. And as we've seen, I mean, this piece is ready to applique. So I'm going to use my silk thread to use a tiny blanket stitch to applique this piece down. Now basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to make my stitch really tiny. So this width here, this is probably, it's less than 1/4 of an inch. But I'm probably going to use, my stitch is probably going to go about 1/3 of the width of this, okay? And I'm going to try to, I always like to start my applique, regardless of what technique I'm using, on sort of a straight part of the piece. So I'm going to bring this up at the back, okay, right at the edge of my applique piece. I'm going to bring it back. I'm going to pull my thread to the left, and I'm going to take my first stitch. Let's see if I can get close up. My first stitch right along the side where my needle came up to begin with. That's the first stitch. Okay. And then I'm going to keep moving my thread to the left, hold it in place, and take a second stitch. As in all blanket stitching, what's important here is to be as uniform as possible. And even though the thread is, we're making these stitches on top of the applique, you'll see that because of the silk thread, and I'm using one that's really close to, it's an off-white, you can hardly see the stitches. Okay. And then as I move along, I just keep taking those pins out. If I see that there's any kind of fraying as I move along, as I said before, depending on the fabric, some fabrics fray more than others. And this one doesn't really fray that much, but if I see that there is any fraying as I go along, then I will just dab a little bit of fray check along the edge You got to be careful not to put too much on. It's just a little bit that you might need. Okay. To prevent any further fraying. Depending on the fabric, in some cases I will apply fray check to the entire edge of the piece, especially with really tiny pieces, because any kind of handling just sort of makes them fall apart. Okay, and I will continue this way until the whole piece is appliqued.